workshops. It really does increase the knowledge and skills of our community members. Most of the time people will go home and they'll talk about, even if it's just a little piece that they learned about in a workshop, which is always great. So not just the people that are here today, but also your family and friends may learn a little bit about composting when you get done. Also, we like to give people the hands-on experience. At River Keepers, we have a little motto. We like to get people wet and dirty, because you are more likely to remember the experience, appreciate it a little bit more, and more likely to either hook up that rain barrel or set the compost tumbler somewhere in your yard and utilize it when you're all done. Also, workshops give community members a bit of a higher sense of obligation regarding their impacts on water quality, so kind of give you a bigger picture kind of aspect of how small actions can make a big difference. And because they work. So that's why we do them every year. So what is composting? Big question. Composting is very simply, it's the natural breakdown of the organic materials by microorganisms in the soil. The end product, which is called compost, is a rich organic matter full of nutrients and other benefits. And here I have a sample of a completed compost and what it should look like. You guys can feel free to look at this so you kind of know what to look for your compost bin when you're all done. Kind of sealed on there tight. If they go to can this. You know, you can smell it. It really just smells like dirt. So you shouldn't have anything recognizable in here. It looks like soil, smells like soil. But I really like this example because somebody didn't take their fruit sticker off. So it just shows that is true compost when labels are left on. So there's many benefits for compost when it comes to compost. But just to name a few that we have here listed, composting systems such as bins, piles, help to speed up the natural decay process of waste. Typically that process is very slow, and so composting kind of helps speed that process up a little bit. And also when you do your own compost bin or pile, you have the control of what goes in there, because you have to remember whatever goes in your compost pile will most likely go back into your soil or your potted plants or whatever you plan on using your compost for. So that's one really big thing with doing composting yourself, is you really get to control what goes in there and what ends up in your soils afterwards. It's also pretty easy. Composting can really be as simple or complicated as you want it to be. Today we have a very simple compost tumbler design, which I know many of you looked at our example over here. But you could even just have a pile in your backyard. It just is as simple as that, or you can buy those big fancy manufactured bins that have all different levels and stuff. So it's really, like I said, as easy or complicated as you want it to be. And you can just start with leaves and grass clippings if you want. Just start with some yard waste, which is what a lot of people do, and then maybe the next year they'll start adding some of your kitchen scraps. We'll go over what can and cannot be put in compost when it comes to kitchen scraps in just a little bit. Composting can also save money. It reduces or possibly eliminates the need to buy and use chemical fertilizers. The average American lawn uses 10 times more fertilizer on their yard than a conventional farm field. So that's pretty amazing, because so many people have the mentality, oh, I want more green, so they just throw the stuff on there. But unfortunately, a lot of that stuff just gets leached through the soil or runs off into our storm drains, which goes directly into the river. So it can reduce or eliminate the need to use those chemicals. Also reduces your trash costs. So if you are putting your yard waste, your kitchen scraps in your garbage, and if you start to compost them instead, you're going to notice you're not going to have to fill garbage at the end of the week. And also it saves taxpayer dollars. The money that our tax dollars that go into water treatment and wastewater treatment, all of that will be saved if we have less waste in our environment. Another thing when it comes to fertilizers, excess nitrogen will not impede, that's not the right word. Excess nitrogen will encourage growth of aquatic plants and algae in our water systems, including our rivers, lakes, and wetlands. And it also can clog intakes, and it's really, really bad for aquatic life. So we want to make sure that we keep our nitrogen and phosphorus levels down, and compost will help with that. It's also earth friendly. It is generally a phosphorus-free fertilizer, so we do promote not using the phosphorus in any fertilizer. If you're unfamiliar, when you buy a package of fertilizer, there's 3 numbers, and phosphorus is the number in the middle. So if you guys do choose to use some fertilizer, we just encourage you to buy 0 phosphorus, so that middle number is going to be a 0. Around here in the Red River Valley, our soils are naturally sufficient for the amount of phosphorus we have in there, so we really don't need a whole lot of extra stuff, phosphorus in particular. And composting, as I mentioned earlier, it reduces your waste in general, so that's less waste that's going into the landfills. It promotes healthy soil. It improves soil structure and texture, especially up here with our really hard clay soils. If you mix your compost in to the top few inches of that, it's way easier to work with, and I know that from personal experience. And it also increases the soil's ability to hold nutrients, water, and air, just because it kind of gives it a little bit more space to have those microbes moving around, the earthworms and that kind of stuff. Increases the organic matter in soil, which is where most of the nutrients are that our plants need. And so because of that, it helps stimulate healthy root development in our plants, whether it's flowers or vegetables or trees or whatever you're growing. So if you look at this graph or this pie chart that we have here, this is straight from the EPA. So they've done a lot of research on the average American household waste stream. So if you look at this, and like I said, I'll get into the do's and don'ts of what you can put in your compost, but typically it's food scraps, yard trimmings, and most paper. So if you take all 3 of those categories, you can reduce your waste by about 50%. So that's pretty amazing, just from the stuff that we can compost. So that's not including the stuff that we recycle. That's just stuff you can compost. Garbage handling is one of the top expenses for many cities. So if we all did a little bit of composting, we could help reduce that cost. And landfills, they're doing just that. They are filling our land, and so anything that we can do to help reduce that would be awesome, because then our generations behind us won't have to worry about where are we going to put the rest of the garbage, because hopefully we will have gotten into the habit of composting and recycling, so we have very little waste to begin with. Landfills are the single largest direct human source of methane, but I am proud to say that the City of Fargo does an excellent job with their landfill. They use wind, solar, and they actually capture a lot of the methane that comes out of the landfill, and they convert it into electricity that they use at the landfill. So Fargo does a really good job. They're kind of one of the leading landfills in the country when it comes to that stuff, so that's pretty awesome. Some plant nutrients that you can get from composting. Technically, compost is not a fertilizer, but it does contain a lot of those essential nutrients that plants need to survive. Phosphorus and nitrogen are mostly in organic forms, unlike a lot of the fertilizers that you buy at stores. It's a synthetic phosphorus and nitrogen, and so the plants have a hard time absorbing a lot of those nutrients. So when you put in natural fertilizers like compost, the plants really know what to do with it, and they can access it a little bit easier. Mature compost contains over 40 trace elements that are essential for plant growth, so that's a huge spectrum of nutrients that compost holds. So down to the recipe. Essential for composting, we have 1 part green, 4 parts brown, and then you need some air and you need some water. And we'll get into the details here in a second of what are greens and what are browns. But first, let's talk about the organic materials. They're the materials that dictate the amount of air and moisture in your compost pile. Typically, those will come from green materials. And then also, it will dictate how long each pile takes to become compost. Now, the decomposers, these are the workers of your compost pile. They're actually the microbes, fungi, bacteria that are in your compost, and they're in there eating away at all that stuff, all that good stuff that you put in your compost. Also earthworms, snails, centipedes, all those other larger decomposers, they are attracted to compost piles, but they're good pests, they're not bad pests. So really we wouldn't call them pests, I guess. And a lot of these things come from the organic materials that you put in, whether it's your grass clippings, your yard, your kitchen waste. And air is essential because decomposition is an aerobic process, so we need that air in there to make sure we help speed up that decomposition process. And with a proper mix of materials, you can ensure proper airflow. Moisture is important. High moisture displaces air and slows decomposition process. We do have a little troubleshooting guide that we'll give you guys, and so if you have a pile that's starting to smell, there's quite a few different options of things that you can do. Low moisture also will slow the process of the decomposers. High temperatures are needed for the decomposition and breakdown of the pathogens, chemicals, and even weed seeds. I believe if you do some research on this, there's a lot of debate out there on what temperature your compost pile should be, what temperature it should be when you turn it, what temperature it should be to kill the seeds, the weed seeds. But the average I have found, the work it'll start breaking down at about 100 degrees, but it depends on the decomposers themselves, but they will work anywhere between 55 and 160 degrees. They suggest you don't have a pile that goes over that because then it may get too hot and will kind of start to slow the process again. So turning the materials in your compost pile can help increase the temperature. When it comes to aeration, when you have a compost pile or a bin, the air will come in from the sides and the bottom, and then so it's going to be hot in the center. So if you just have a pile and you want to turn it, you want to make sure that outside material gets inside and vice versa. But then with a compost tumbler like we're making today, it's a really nice design. There's little forks that are on the inside, so when you actually turn it, that will help stir it up and get the outside in and the inside out. Some composting tips when it comes to water. Again, the decomposition requires water, and it has to be just the right amount. If it's too dry, too wet, you'll either not have oxygen, slow the process, all that kind of stuff. So the water content should be about 40 to 60%. So if you imagine you take a handful of compost and you squeeze it in your hand, it should feel about like a squeezed out sponge. So you may have a little bit of water coming out in between your fingers, but it shouldn't be dripping out. You should not have large drips coming out. If you do, then you have a little too much water in there. And then you just got to add some browns. Again, the temperature, a lot of debate on what's good, what's bad, what's perfect, what's not perfect. But that 135 degrees is the weed seed killing zone. And it also will break down some of the pathogens that you may have in your pile. There's some composters that swear by their composting thermometer, and there is a specific thermometer out there that you can get just for composting piles. It is absolutely not necessary for you guys to get one of those, but some people prefer them. One gentleman that I was reading, he said it saves him a lot of labor time because he won't turn the pile unless his thermometer tells him to turn the pile. But it's personal preference. If you guys just want to get in the habit of doing it every week, that's awesome as well. And it doesn't have to get hot for the decomposition process to work. It just quickens the process a little bit if it's a little bit warmer. So let's get into the details of browns and greens. So browns, that's where your carbon, typically your dry material, is going to come from. So things like leaves, straw, hay, dead plants, preferably non-weed plants. And if they are weeds, you don't want to put weeds with seeds in your pile. Non-recyclable paper, so things like paper towels, plates, napkins. You just want to make sure that any of these paper products that you put in your pile doesn't have any grease or oil on them. So if you had a piece of pizza on a paper plate, you don't want to compost that paper plate because it has all that greasy material on it. Eggshells, whether you put them in your compost or you just crush them up, let them dry, and put them on your garden, they add a lot of calcium to the soil, so eggshells are really good. Sawdust, but you want to be careful with sawdust because you may not want to put sawdust in there that is from treated lumber because it's treated with chemicals, so you probably don't want to put those in. And you can also use some used potting soil. So you don't necessarily have a green thumb indoors or your plant dies for the season or what have you, you can take that and throw it in your compost pile. With the carbon is carbon and nitrogen both, so between the browns and the greens, those are the the major building blocks that our soil needs to be healthy. So that's why it's a good combination of the browns and greens. So for greens, that's where your nitrogen comes from, typically wet materials. You can use fruit and vegetable peels, juicy items versus stale bread. The juicy items will break down a little bit quicker than the dry bread. Moldy stale bread, grass or yard clippings, garden trimmings, coffee grounds and filters. You do want to be careful with the coffee ground and filters. That's not something you want to add every single day. I've heard that coffee grounds have a bit of acidity in them, so you probably don't want to add them all the time, just once in a while. Tea leaves and tea bags, and leftovers that don't have any meat or oil in them. So why do we need these browns and greens? As I stated, they are the building blocks of healthy soil, so that's very important. The browns decay very slowly, while the greens decay very rapidly. So the browns and greens have a very good marriage when it comes to composting. Coarse browns can keep the pile aerated, and the greens, too many greens may be the cause of poor aeration. The browns tend to accumulate in the fall, so a lot of times people will just make a pile in their backyard or someplace that they would have access to it throughout the winter. And then so they could still compost in the winter if you have a composter indoors or a heated garage or something like that. And then the greens tend to accumulate in spring and summer. Now I saw this one guy, he had an excellent idea. Since greens really do accumulate in the spring and summer, and you don't have a whole lot in the wintertime, he started freezing them. So he would collect all of his food scraps throughout the week, and then it would fit in a large 1-gallon plastic bag, and he'd put all the scraps in there, typically cut them up a little bit, because the smaller the pieces are, the quicker they'll decompose. And then he would just throw them in his freezer. So then he could just take them out and thaw it out and add them to a compost pile whenever he was ready. I was like, genius. The browns get tied up in the soil if they're not fully decomposed. And the greens supply nitrogen for composting. And again, it's just a really good marriage between browns and greens. That's why we need both of them. So this is a list of things you definitely do not want to put in your compost. Cat and dog manure, many of them contain disease organisms. I'm not sure if you guys remember about the community garden that we had downtown. Last year, 2 years ago, a lot of the citizens that lived around there, a lot of people just think any type of feces is a fertilizer. And so during the winter, they would let their dog go in the garden thinking that they were doing a good thing, but unfortunately the garden got so contaminated that they can't plant it for a couple of years. So make sure you don't put any of that stuff in your compost.
What about any residue that's on your grass materials? Is that something that you need? Like obviously you're going to pick up after your dog or your neighbors might in your yard, but is that something you need to worry about?
Bob, would you? I don't think I would be too concerned as long as it's...
I would be, I mean, not to get into a detailed description, but most dog feces is picked up solid.
Right.
And so there would be very, very little left.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I was involved in that community garden issue, and most dogs are okay, but you don't know unless you want to spend a lot of money finding out. So the odds are pretty slim, but but it'd be foolish to put dog feces in. So I wouldn't worry about if it was on the lawn just picked up.
Yeah.
I'd worry more about the chemicals that you might be spraying on the lawn.
Right.
So weed killer would not be good.
Right.
Because you don't want to eat that.
Yes, that's another good point. So if you highly fertilize your lawn, you may not want to use your grass clippings in your compost pile. So it comes down to personal preference. A lot of this stuff comes down to personal preference. Charcoal ashes, you don't want to put those in your compost because when you grill, the fats from the meat fall down and they get soaked into those ashes. So then you just be putting all that stuff in your compost. You want to stay away from charcoal ashes.
What about fireplace ashes?
Some people like to put them in, but if you do put them in a very small amount at a time, but again, it comes down to the type of wood that you use. Some firewood is treated, some isn't. So personal preference when it comes down. But just not a whole lot, just a little at a time.
But excuse me, but on the whole, ashes are alkaline.
But they still hold some of the, like charcoal ashes, they'll still have some of the components of the meat.
But I mean, I was thinking of your wood.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
With the alkaline, and our soil is alkaline enough.
Yeah, that's true. Herbicide or pesticide treated plants goes back to the lawn. If it's highly treated, may not want to use that. Meat, grease, bones, dairy products, cooking oil. A lot of these things can attract rodents or other pests. A lot of stuff you don't want hanging around your yard. Pine needles, magnolia leaves, obviously we don't need to worry about that up here, unless you have a beautiful magnolia tree in your greenhouse at home, which would be awesome. These take a long time to break down, and pine needles are highly acidic, so it's another reason you don't want to put pine needles in. Any sick or diseased plants, because a compost pile may not be able to kill all of the pathogens in the diseased plant, so the disease may just stay in your compost and then go back into your soil, and that's not what you want to do. Treated wood, again, the chemicals are a little bit toxic. Weeds with seeds on them. All of these materials can attract pests, generate foul odors, or contaminate the compost. So we want to stay away from those. So a lot of people ask, should you shred your yard waste? Again, it comes down to personal preference, but I personally would say yes, because the smaller the pieces, the quicker they'll break down, and also it allows the microbes to get enough air and moisture in there. So we do suggest to chip or shred your twigs, but you certainly don't have to if you don't want to. The disadvantage of not shredding your yard waste, it will decrease the airflow in the pile. It could lead to anaerobic conditions, and that means without oxygen, and remember air is one of the main 4 components. And the pile may need to be turned more often. So personal preference, if you want to put a little bit more labor in your compost, then go right ahead. That's just fine. A couple composting tips. As soon as the decomposition process begins, you will notice your pile to decrease in volume. Do not be tempted to put more stuff in there, because once you add more stuff, you're basically starting the process all over again. So you really kind of got to do one batch at a time. Do you have a picture of other systems? Yeah, okay. So aerate by turning, mixing the tumbler about once a week. Some of the problems that you'll find, if the pile doesn't heat up, you might want to add more greens to the compost. You may need to add water, you may need to aerate. If there's an ammonia or rotten egg smell, often you just need to add some brown materials and turn it a little bit. Large amounts of apples or kitchen scraps may attract wasps or other unwelcome pests. So turn more frequently if you have a lot of those types of things in your compost. And how to be an active composter? Turn every 5 to 7 days. A good way to do it, just do it every Sunday night or something before you go to bed, or get into a routine of doing it about once a week. That's a pretty good habit. And again, it's just about moving that outer material to the inside with the tumblers. It makes it a very easy process. Now, these estimates in these next couple slides, they're all estimates, but you'll typically get about 1 batch a season. And it depends again on what you have in your compost. If you're just doing yard waste, it may take a little bit longer. If you're doing kitchen scraps and things like that, that'll help decomposition process speed up a little bit. So estimates, about 4 weeks after the pile, 4 weeks the pile will produce less heat, and then you're going to want to, it should remain about 100 degrees after another 4 weeks. It probably won't heat up that much because a lot of the decomposition process is being completed, and it will be about 1/3 of the volume of what you initially put in there. And before you use your compost, you want to let it sit for 2 to 4 weeks. I'm not quite sure the reasoning behind that. I didn't really find a good answer, but I did see that in quite a few different articles that I read, but nobody really gave a reason on why to let it cure for 4 weeks. And when it comes to placing your tumbler, bin, or pile, some of the things you want to consider, you definitely want to keep away from trees, wells, or outbuildings. You want to make sure that it's in a good drainage spot in case there is a little excess water, so it can drip out and drain into a good spot in your yard. Some people like to put it near the place where the compost is going to be used, so they'll put it next to their flower bed or their vegetable garden. And you want to make sure that you're a good neighbor. You want to keep the compost area in control. You don't want to leaking under the fence to your neighbor's yard, they might not appreciate that. And then easily accessible. You know, a lot of people don't want to walk a half a mile to go haul their compost back and forth to their garden. Also, it's a good idea to keep it near a water source. Partially shaded area is always nice. Protected from drying winds, otherwise you're just going to have to add water more often if it's in a really windy area. And you also want to avoid places that will interfere with garden or lawn activities. So the next picture is just a few different designs of compost piles, bins that are available for you to make and do it yourself. Of course, we prefer the top left corner, a beautiful example right there. But again, there are so many different, you can just use a couple stakes, surround it with chicken wire, put your stuff in there and turn it every week. The one in the bottom right corner, she made that out of used pallets, and she even made a door out of one of the pallets, so I thought that was a pretty ingenious idea. The one on the top right corner is actually like a stage compost pile. So they start it in bin 1, and then when it gets to a certain stage, they'll put it in bin 2, and then they'll add new stuff to bin 1. And then when the second bin gets to a certain stage, they'll put it in the third bin for final and curing. So that way you can just kind of have a constant supply of compost instead of just doing one batch at a time. So lots of different ways you can compost. And one of them is vermicomposting. I am getting ready to start vermicomposting, so I'm very excited about this. When you compost, vermicomposting is just basically composting with worms. Specifically red wigglers. You may find some information out there that tells you can go in your backyard and dig a hole and dig up some earthworms. That is completely incorrect. You want to use red wigglers specifically. I almost feel like they were kind of bred for vermicomposting because it's like the only one that people use.
So where do you get red wigglers?
You can buy them online. If you know somebody that vermicomposts, because they do reproduce, they are willing to unload some of their worms. But they're not too expensive. I can't remember the price. But I'm a pretty frugal person, and when I saw the price, I was like, huh, that's not bad. So it can't be too expensive, otherwise I would have been like, nope, not vermicomposting. The worms, they can actually survive on a kitchen scrap diet only, aside from the bedding material, which is a lot of shredded paper and that kind of stuff. And you don't need a whole lot of space, and it is perfect for people that live in apartments. So if you live in an apartment, there's no excuse for you not to compost, because there are ways to do it. Just a little bit about the easiest vermicomposting do-it-yourself bin. You just need a couple totes, drill some holes on the top, some on the bottom, and then in the second bin you want to put like rocks or potted like little 4-inch pots upside down there. The point is you just want to make sure that when the first bin goes inside the second bin, there's going to be airflow coming in from the bottom. A drill to drill those holes, and bedding, you can use shredded newspaper, leaves, those kinds of things. And then of course you need your red wigglers. It's a ratio of about 2 pounds of red wigglers to 1 pound of food. And then some kitchen scraps and some water. If you guys are interested in that, you can ask me some questions, otherwise do some research on your own, but I figured I would just brush on that subject since it does involve composting. Of course you can buy vermicomposting bins, but they are so easy to make. So easy to make, and will save you over $100 if you just do it yourself, because they are pretty expensive. So when compost is finished, it will have an earthy smell, the texture will be loose and crumbly, you won't be able to recognize any of the organic material that went in there, and the color will be dark brown. Again, feel free to look at the sample, touch it, don't eat it, just touch it, smell it, just so you guys can kind of get an idea of what your compost, when your compost will be ready, what it will look like. So when you are ready to use your compost, there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. You can use it as a soil amendment. We suggest you mix it into the top 4 to 6 inches of your soil. It helps loosens those clay soils, improves drainage, a lot of those benefits that I mentioned earlier. And it will also help sandy soils if any of you live in a sandy soil area. Potting soils, you can also put them in your house plants. They suggest to kind of screen it out so you get the really, really fine compost, but it's not necessary. A good ratio, if you're going to use them in your potting soil, about half compost, half potting mix, so a little half and half mixture. In the garden, you can mulch around the base of your plants, helps retain the water, as any mulch does. Sprinkle around, or sprinkle in the bottom of seed rows before planting to give those plants a little extra boost of nutrients when they get started. And if you use it for a surface mulch in your garden or landscape, they suggest a maximum of 3 inches deep, because that's the level that they found will hold the best moisture and nutrients around your plants. You want to start a little way out from your trunk. You don't want to put the mulch right up next to the trunk of a tree. And you want to extend it out to the drip line. That picture on the bottom right there shows a drip line. So basically it's just the extent of the tree and straight down. So that's a drip line. You want to extend a little bit farther out than that drip line. And mulch provides a lot of benefits. Just a few are protection from temperature extremes, which it sounds like we may have issues with this summer. Slows moisture loss from soil, which compost will also help this summer. And provides some slow release nutrients. So remember folks, a rind is a terrible thing to waste, so we should all compost. I just love that saying. Okay, so before we get into the step-by-step process, does anybody have any questions? No? All right. So what we're going to do, we don't have enough drills for everybody, so we have to share. And we'd really like to go through this process step by step. So if we could just do one step and make sure everybody's on the same page, and then we'll move on to the next step after that. So the parts that you need to make your compost tumbler, they are all right here. We have drills, screwdrivers, pliers, markers, because we're going to need to mark places. And then we have hinges and door latches, barrel latches, technically. These are the nuts and bolts that we'll use to screw the hinges and door latches on. And then these bad boys are going to be the forks that we're going to put inside of the compost tumbler to help stir it up. So, and one good thing, if you guys ever want to make these at home, you can really make it out of anything. You can get a barrel like this. You can use an old garbage bin or whatever you want. But just look around in your junk drawers or your garage or your shop or your shed to see if you have any of these parts, because a lot of people have this stuff lying around and they don't even know it until they look for it. It's like, hey, I didn't have to spend any money on parts, so that's always exciting. We're all about recycling and reusing around here. All right. Oh, one thing. An evaluation is attached the very last page of your PowerPoint. If you guys could please fill those out before you leave. We do these workshops at least once a year, and we want to get better and better every time we do this, and we can't do that without your help. So if you guys would be so kind to fill those out, you can give them to Ashley, myself, or even Bob when you're all finished. That would be awesome. Did I miss anything? Ashley? Bob? All right, let's get started.